Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Guvanj, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, I'm very happy to be chatting with my friend Dan Dickson. Dan is an urban planner and architect who is interested in how to solve intractable problems rooted in the built environment. He has spent much of his career working in architecture firms on planning and design work, ranging in scale from the building to the region, exploring equity issues relating to transportation access, criminal justice, education, and housing affordability. Dan has also worked for NYC's Housing Preservation and Development, where he facilitated the funding, construction, and maintenance of affordable housing in support of the city's Housing New York plan. Currently, Dan's role as Director of Planning and Design at the Battery Park City Authority has allowed him to participate in leveraging public funds to create a more sustainable and resilient New York City with an emphasis on the public realm. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Dan Dickson. Dan is the Director of Planning and Design at Battery Park City Authority. Dan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice to be here. So should I start with a little bit of my background?
That would be amazing. Yes. Please tell us more about who you are, your background, and how you came to where you are today.
Okay, sounds good. So my background and my career has taken a few different turns. So I'll couch it in starting at a liberal arts institution at Vassar College. I majored in urban studies, which allowed me to have exposure to a lot of different things. And I was pretty sure that I wanted to become an architect. So I went right into grad school, right at University of Illinois. And, it's a great program, learned a lot about engineering and practically how to build a building, but it also exposed me to a few more urban classes that I didn't have exposure to at Vassar. So I ended up dual majoring in urban planning and architecture, and was lucky enough to be invited to join a firm back in New York right when I graduated. And so I was lucky enough to work for Perkins Eastman and Pfeiffer Partners for 9 years of my career, doing a lot of urban scale design work, but really starting to work on projects that, the types of projects that interested me the most were these kind of intractable urban issues that had a lot of facets to it. So I started choosing projects that had to do more with transportation and equity issues, and touching on things like criminal justice with the mayor's office for the borough-based jails project, which was really fascinating. I had the opportunity to work in the Middle East and see some very bizarre projects occurring there, and kind of the other side of the coin with regards to equity. And then when I realized that I had learned enough at that firm, I decided to move on to Pfeiffer Partners and did a little bit of education planning for them. But this was around the same time that the pandemic hit, and the birth of my first daughter. And so both of those things had me rethinking my career and thinking, what impact is my work having on the world? What is my legacy going to be if I keep working at architecture firms? So that led me to think about, okay, how can my experience in the built environment be used to solve these more intractable problems? So affordable housing seemed like the next logical step for me. So I applied to a few positions at New York City HPD, which stands for Housing Preservation and Development. A lot of people think that that's preservation of buildings, like kind of historic landmarks, but really it's the city's arm of producing affordable housing, whether through new construction or preservation units, existing affordability. And I worked there for a year and a half and learned a lot about the issues that we'll talk about in this podcast. But then I moved on because I was kind of missing the creative aspect. So now I'm the Director of Planning and Design, still for a public agency, the Battery Park City Authority. And we can talk about the issues of affordability in Battery Park City that I've seen also. But really, working for New York City HPD opened my eyes to a lot of affordability issues and a lot of the reasons why affordability is such an intractable problem. So when you asked me to be on this, I was very excited.
I mean, it only makes sense. Like, obviously, like since beginning of your career, you're like touching upon urban matters. So obviously that is something very near and dear to our heart at Sauer. Also, like personally, I think with my like daughter coming to life, I was so much more hyper aware of like what type of future we're leaving, right, in our cities. So I relate to all of that. And I would love to, obviously, like you mentioned, even, you know, back as like practicing as an architect, an urban planner, you already started to observe issues around equity, right? And of course, maybe that exposure led you to working in affordable housing. And as you zoomed into that further, what were some of the things, not about just, you know, the fact that the lack of it, right? But like the
Yeah.
reasons around that, and even like our approach as firms or cities in order to realize them.
Yeah, and I think, you bring up a good point, is what power do architecture firms or urban design firms have to combat this issue? I think it's really useful to think about materiality and sustainability and create places for people to live that are high quality, but there's only so much leverage you have as a private firm to change these issues. Really, the change has to come from a national or state or city level or agency level. And that's something I learned when I started working on these very complex issues. Obviously, a lot of city agencies would be involved, and you see firsthand the types of bureaucracy and red tape and a lot of agency coordination that's required on a lot of these very complex problems. So that's what really opened my eyes to how to solve problems. It really has to come from the city level, agencies working together, and some are better than others at working together to solve problems. That's what I found.
100%. And the fact that you already mentioned, you know, we can't necessarily do this as just public or just private, and definitely without the public support, it's really hard to realize only on the private end. And it's already showing that, you know, we kind of need to address this through collaboration, and even not only on like the organizational level, but even with the communities,
Yeah,
right? In
yeah,
our experience, we often observe that being very, the methods around that being very insufficient, right? So community engagement is often seen as like, yeah, we distributed a survey, or there are community board meetings, which are not necessarily known to be effective, right?
right.
So how did you see, like, you know, differences around around this, like approaches based on, you know, on the private side and public side? And what are you observing that are not necessarily working and that we need to address?
Sure, sure. So I actually was lucky enough to be on my community board when I lived in the East Village. And that, I would recommend to anyone who's interested in solving these bigger issues is to get involved in your community, try to join the board. I was lucky enough, with my urban design and architecture background, they were looking for people to serve from my field. So that was a little bit easier for me. But once you're there, you understand what people are interested in, what people are going to shy away from, or what people are going to be vociferously advocating for. You understand what NIMBY means, not in my backyard. You get a lot of that. But to your point about the public engagement process, really depending on the project, that can be a really enriching process. For example, the mayor's office for borough-based jails, obviously the idea for the project came from above, but the public process really injected a lot of changes to the project, and it was allowed to kind of be sculpted by the public process to some extent, because there are a lot of community groups and a lot of really active community organizations that feel very strongly about criminal justice, for example, and affordable housing to an extent as well. And so if you can really open your ears to these types of organizations that have decades of experience, you start to learn about things that you hadn't thought of when addressing a project like that.
Yeah. And how do you see the approach, the right approach and the interest could scale even within the city, right? Like, of course, it's no, question that we're short of affordable housing and we need to address that. And here and there, we see some really like great approaches on addressing that. And my question often becomes like, how do you think this could scale? And maybe we go back to the collaboration of public-private, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think really when it comes to scale, I think you have to have a pilot project and show that something can work. And that's something that has been tried at agencies like HPD was always trying to roll out smaller scale projects to see if something could actually function as part of the solution. And I will give them a lot of credit for that. That's, it's something that's injecting more sustainability, more electrification, and the incorporation of serving a lot of different types of income groups. And it's led to a diversity of projects that were not looked at 10 years ago. So once something has been shown, its use case has been shown to be successful, that's when you can scale it up and it can become part of the solution.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, like the benchmarking. I think it's, especially in the built environment, it's so powerful and crucial. And sometimes in a good way, sometimes not necessarily, right? Because, for example, in the tech industry, if we try out something and if it fails, we're like, okay, that was the first prototype. Let's move on to the next, right? But I feel like in the built environment, when something is tried and it fails, the benchmarking is a little bit harsh. It's like, well, that failed, right? And we're already, developing a project takes so long. And by the time maybe it's like in operation, it has been like 5 years, maybe. Like, should we really also be benchmarking to that, right? And they're often, we talk to a lot of affordable housing developers nationwide, and there's clear frustration in some like processes, and they're all curious to try something different, but they're also so scared to try anything that is untried, so how do you, and maybe this, this can be encouraged at the public level, which could have impact on the private, but I would also love to like get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and you're totally right about benchmarking, and the issue is that what's successful to you and me might not be successful to other people who are viewing the project. So you have that conflict with regard to, is it successful? The other thing is timeline. Like you said, something right now seems like a good idea, but in 5 years it might not. And I'll give you a couple examples. During the pandemic, there was this great idea to house the unhoused in hotels that were sitting empty, which, from where we're sitting, seems like a great idea. It's not far from me. I live on the Upper West Side, and there were a few hotels that were filled with the unhoused. And it's a great idea, but of course there was pushback from the community because, a few incidents occurred that people weren't happy with, and the community was up in arms about it. So this idea of, is it successful, and how do you measure success is a really difficult problem. One other thing that I'll talk about, we might want to return to what the problem is and what's causing the problem before we reach a solution. One major thing in New York that's causing the problem is zoning and code. So it seems like a great idea to limit development in certain neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods that have existed for a long time. You want to kind of preserve that character with regard to scale, with regard to historic standards, with regard to sense of feel in the community. But what it does is really, it takes the developer out of the equation, and a project that could work in that environment is not allowed to proceed. And so what it's created is a housing shortage, really, citywide. And I think we're getting a little bit better at addressing that. Mayor Adams, for example, I think has rolled out, or he's spoken to rezoning certain areas, especially around transit hubs, which is a great idea, and trying to require some level of affordability with these projects too, which is definitely what's needed and can be part of the solution going forward.
Yeah.
But that's an example of, it seems like a great idea, but then decades down the line, you realize that it's having all these downstream impacts that you weren't foreseeing.
Exactly. And, zoning, it doesn't come to life overnight, and you don't fast test and then move on, right? Like once it's there, the impacts of it like exponentially grows for a while until we address it. And often policy lags in compared to the needs we have, which is normal, right? This is not unique to real estate. This is in general.
Yes.
But how can there be more, I guess, like also rapid communication around the needs that might like look into quick rezoning opportunities,
Yes.
or even like maybe some slight adjustments. And I live that. I feel like personally, I live in downtown Brooklyn, and I used to live in Fort Greene, which, for the any of the listeners who don't know, downtown Brooklyn has that now like some of the highest buildings in like Brooklyn.
Yes.
There's continually like sound of construction, new buildings are coming up left and right, whereas Fort Greene, that is right next to it, is quite historic and picturesque, and I hope it never changes.
Yes.
At the same time, the problem that you're mentioning, like all the housing need around here, maybe it's like also getting in the way. So how do you balance that is a big question. And also with an affordable component, right? Like I don't necessarily think downtown Brooklyn is affordable, but at the same time, I also see that it didn't become Highline, right? Like I think when
Exactly.
like earlier in the day, when I would talk to people, like I got so much like bad like comments on Highline. I'm like, that's not Highline's fault. Like that's a great project. It's more like we didn't have to make it a architecture role, like I think that's, so I'm glad, downtown Brooklyn is not becoming that, but I could also see like there is still like great need. But do you see kind of the difference in approach? Like to me, that's a great visual in terms of comparing here versus like what happened at Highline before. And do you feel like the city is getting in the way of that more and more?
Those are three great examples. I too think Fort Greene is probably the best of the three. But
Yeah.
It's the question of where does development happen if it doesn't happen near places we love? So that's the difficult thing. So downtown Brooklyn, for example, what they did to their one feather in their cap is that they opened the doors to development and created a lot more housing units. But the downstream impact was that it resulted in a lot of very tall condo towers that feel out of place.
Yes.
And kind of lend this feeling of really lack of place, if we're being honest, to downtown Brooklyn. The High Line kind of took the opposite approach and was very precious in its choosing of projects. And it's created kind of this Disneyfication of Chelsea, which is kind of the opposite problem, but also still a problem. I think what you have to do, and in my role at Battery Park City, actually, it's related to this, is I think you have to have some oversight on the types of projects that get built, make it feel like the character is being maintained in that neighborhood. There's ways that you can provide a lot of density to a neighborhood and still be in character, for example. And another thing, obviously, to the topic of at hand, is that I don't think downtown Brooklyn had enough affordability restrictions when they built, or any really. So what you do when you try to filter the projects for character and add affordability restrictions is a couple things. One, you can have a little bit more agency over what gets built. And two, you infuse different income levels and more diversity where you want to keep it. So from a person to person viewpoint, that's improved, and you also get more units, which hopefully brings down prices or keeps them relatively manageable.
Right. And is that your focus in Battery Park City? And it would be good to also like share with our audience, I guess, like the texture and fabric of Battery Park City so we better understand. I used to work in the neighborhood,
Yeah.
and this was pre-Sandy and everything was commercial, and post-Sandy a lot of things changed in the area. So I don't know if you want to give some like contextual information there.
Sure. So I've only been at Battery Park City for 2 months-ish, so I'm fairly new there. But as a district downtown, it's quite unique. It began as a project when the Twin Towers were built, and they had all this excess excavated soil, and they were also dredging the Hudson River at the same time, and so they had all this excess fill. They decided to make this brand new development on the side of Manhattan, lower Manhattan. And at first it was touted as being this haven for more affordable housing, a little bit more of a give back to the community. And that's shifted a little bit over time. Now there is a little bit of luxury condo feeling of being priced out in the neighborhood. Which is unfortunate, but there is still some affordability, and I'm trying to navigate as I go forward, how we can potentially grow that proportion. But Battery Park City is fairly built out at this point. I don't anticipate any new construction happening anytime soon, but a lot of my work is going to be focusing on resiliency, building a seawall along the entire stretch. And anything in the public realm, design or planning wise, I'll have my fingerprints on. But yeah, so that's Battery Park City. But the city as a whole is struggling with its affordable housing as well. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe we should talk about in the last 10-15 years what's been proposed from at the mayor level, and how that's changed things. So de Blasio let's see, I have it in my notes here. In 2014, de Blasio came out with a plan called Housing New York, and it was supposed to add 200,000 affordable units to New York City by 2026. And to HPD's great credit, they were able to create 200,000 new units by 2021. So what happened was they went back and said, okay, let's do Housing New York 2.0, which was supposed to add 100,000 more units by 2026. Obviously, the de Blasio reign ended, and Adams is now there. He's come out with Get Stuff Built, which is, as a country, we're moving more toward these kind of pithy little slogans,
Like very direct.
are a little cheesy, but his idea is to get 500,000 new units built by 2032. So there is some silver lining in New York. There is some hope for the future. And as I said, he's approaching this problem through a few different lenses. One is changing the zoning, especially around transit hubs, which is huge for developing affordable housing. And the other thing, which I can speak to from personal experience, is that there's a lot of red tape and a lot of public process needed to go through whenever you create an affordable housing project. And so his goal is to kind of try to streamline those processes and make it easier to go from zero to completion.
I think that's a great point and very insightful, in the sense that those red tapes, I feel like for many developers who are also like working on these projects, are so time consuming and heavy lifting. And
Yes.
they become a huge part of realizing a project where almost the design and construction itself is like, let's just get it done, right? Because the planning and coordination and making it happen just takes so much time that there's not much budget or energy left for the rest. But we also see, I'm sure this is like getting better, but a lot of affordable housing projects could perform so much better in terms of, sustainability and for the people. And I feel like in general, in United States, we're very behind on inclusion in spaces, right? I think we're still benchmarking ADA, which was great, but it's 30 plus years from ADA now. And like, what's next? Meanwhile, in UK, I hear conversations on like intersectionalities of spaces and we're like, I don't hear that much in US. So there's so much more to be done. And I don't know if you see any of those like, I guess, incentives popping up also in these plans, because I feel like the private side really needs more encouragement, incentives, and backing of public to be able to invest time and money and energy into these areas as well.
Yes, and these are all great points. I mean, the great thing about affordable housing is that it touches so many different things. And some of those things can be incentives, as you speak to, and some of them have turned into like administrative burden, to be frank. So, speaking to your point about red tape, to do one of these projects, I would have a checklist 200-300 points long to create a project. And, things like ADA accessibility are of course required. Certain things like electrification and deeper levels of affordability are kind of these carrots that we can dangle. So we can say to the developers, if you create to passive house standards of sustainability, for example, or if you make your building electrified before it's required, or if you guarantee 50% of the units at 30% AMI, affordable average median income levels, then we'll work with you, and you can get more profit, or we'll make it easier for the project to go. But to your point, I mean, developers across the country are getting I don't know what the average is. I think it's something like 20-30% profit for every unit that they build. But the developers that we're working with at HPD are basically doing these projects at a much smaller margin, right? So it really takes some effort on their part to build these projects to begin with. It's kind of like, they're doing, they're participating because they believe in the cause also. And what do? We basically swamp them with all these restrictions and requirements, which makes it even more difficult for them. So I think the incentives for developers need to be a little bit better. I think it would increase the competitive nature of these projects. You would get better quality developers if the margins were a little bit better. It would be easier to do something like a passive house requirement for a building. You would get better and more technically savvy developers doing your projects, rather than someone who's just going to check the box and say, okay, we made units. We want to not only make units, we want to make great units for people who need affordable housing. So it's right now it's kind of difficult. We're slapping people on the wrist for wanting to participate in affordable housing, when really we should be incentivizing them more.
Yeah, and really, like, there is really no one party to blame, but everyone is kind of also responsible in their own way, right? And recognizing that responsibility, because as you said, I think the developers who care most about the people living in their developments and the community is actually affordable housing developers. Like, we have had meetings with more like high-end developers who have just like, yeah, they'll just come, like, it's more about like, I'm presenting the product, they'll come, but like, it's the complete different like approach, and they're equally, I feel like, as frustrated. And on that, shared responsibility, I feel like on architects' end too, like, what we feel is that we're more responsible of, the community co-creation role. I think that has to be more infused into the process. It can't be an afterthought, and we can't necessarily just create spaces, banking on some of the socioeconomic research that has been done, I don't know, a year ago in the process, and just go with that because it's, just convenient and we have only so much time, it's not in the budget. I feel like we need to find out ways to really bring that in. to reflect the research. And because often I think the myth we need to bust, like some of these interventions, yes, like use of quality materials, more like sustainable interventions, they can be added budget, but some of the things that we could do actually may not, or it's very slight difference. And what are those? Like, what can we prioritize? I think we need to take a bit more responsibility on that. Like that is something that we feel also like sour too. And I'm curious to see if you have like any comments on that, on what can be done at each level, especially in engaging communities, so that we're not only, you know, delivering outcomes, which is needed, right? There's lack of the product, so we need the product. But we also, especially considering benchmarking and the impact, like how long that impact is in built environment, how can we put out quality benchmarks, right? Like there are affordable housing developers we meet who are like, if they're like an affordable housing developer we know based in Jersey, they develop a lot of housing for veterans, and therefore they're very interested in trauma-informed design practices, right? Like, so they're actually more considering how can we create better spaces for them, or for seniors, or for people with disabilities. So we could, like, I feel like we should be having those conversations already. So that is kind of like showing that we're like on the, you know, architecture and design side, there's that responsibility for us to infuse that into the process. But also, like, any thoughts on at each level what can be done?
Yes, yes, and those are all great points. I think the difficulty when working with a public agency is that those options are not necessarily always on the table to pursue for better housing, for better products. I'm sure you would agree, some of the best projects that I've worked with have gotten a lot of community input. And that's how you make the best products. You know, the projects where I was working for a developer and they already had their minds made up of what would get built, you're not really thinking about the end user, and you're not really putting out a great product, frankly. But you're right. I think what architecture firms can do is, when they're working for a typical client, it will be more difficult working for a city agency. But if you can think outside the box and present from the outset this level setting of, our ambition is to create a great project that will benefit all the stakeholders. You know, some of the best projects that I've worked on, the first meeting we would have, we would literally think about all the stakeholders that would be impacted by the project and get everyone at the same table and say, listen, these are our initial thoughts, but what we're doing at this meeting is asking you what you'd like to get out of this project, and how can we change the metrics that we're gauging success with, right? That said, you know, there are some things at the agency level that I think that we've done a little bit better at HPD, for example. Affordable housing throughout the city is usually advertised through something called Housing Connect, which can be kind of a backwards feeling interface for a lot of people, kind of confusing. And so one kind of workaround that we've had is, a lot of the projects that I worked on, we would connect them directly to the homeless services placement system. And that process would actually be a little bit easier. So the way that we filled a lot of our units was through formerly homeless individuals. And so you get these opportunities where you're like, oh, well, it would be just as easy to go this route, and the impact would be 10 times better, rather than going via the private market, or going another route. So there are opportunities to be found, but from the private side and the architecture side, I would say use the latitude that you're given working on that type of project to fully embrace the potential of a project.
Yeah, I love that. And I love you touched upon, talking about not only getting, diverse community members at the table and get their opinion on what's happening in the project, but also the collaboration between maybe the city or the developer with community-based organizations, or organizations that have close ties into the community. Just considering, if any translation or input needs to come from a organization that has these like close relationships. Like, I think that we see more often happening, or we see one or the other happening, but like everything all together, like co-creating together with CBOs and the community, and the benefit of that. And I think also to highlight maybe, and this is something I think we came across more in architecture space, when we talk about like co-design. Sometimes experts tend to get territorial, right? Like, what is co-design? Are we gonna all be on like CAD and sketching together? Like, no, right? It's a process. And often like I'm the expert attitude, right? And I feel like, again, I guess if we need to touch upon the responsibilities and job, it's like kind of our job to synthesize what we're hearing, right? Because community may really well understand like what they need, but how they describe it may not necessarily be feasible, right? To like construct, but it is kind of our role to generate insights out of that is actionable. Like, how can we get close to that? How can we deliver that? So in addition to the collaboration piece, I guess like the act of like maybe synthesizing really and interpreting what we're being told, I think is something, I guess, like we could all practice.
Really key. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you spoke to translation. Sometimes that's literal translation from communities that speak other languages. And sometimes, like you said, often the client doesn't know, or the stakeholders don't know what form the project will take. They're telling you what they need, but it might not be what they're envisioning as the end product. Right. And so the great thing about architecture and design in general is that it's problem solving. You're taking all these inputs and saying, okay, well, based on my expertise, I think I would approach it this way, and see how they feel about that. So yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah. I mean, this is like very near and dear to our hearts. So obviously we can talk about it forever, but I also do want to be mindful of time. So I'm gonna jump to the part where, what would you want to say to anyone who wants to make progress in this space or any other space really, to create a better future for all of us? What would be your advice to them?
That's a big question, and it's a big topic. I would say, from my personal experience, it was rethinking what role you wanted to play in this whole thing. I came at it from a professional level, but I've also come at it from just a citizen level, sitting on my community board and trying to better understand the issue. My dad worked at Project Home, which was a homeless services organization in Philadelphia for a number of years. And so he's found some solutions and gotten a lot closer to the problems that way. You can volunteer, you can participate in a local organization. I wanted to speak about the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, which is a nonprofit in New York that's helping buildings convert to co-ops, which is a really forward-looking way to tackle affordable housing. If you make a lot of the decisions for your building, you can keep it affordable and you can have more ownership, literally, and be more tied to the community. So I would say get involved in organizations like that, or think about what tools you might have professionally that you could give to something like this.
I love it. Like, identify your role, but also recognize the role might be changing, evolving, adapting, whatever it might be, but really just taking action in one way or another.
Yeah.
Yes.
And one thing that we didn't talk a lot about, but nationwide we have an affordability crisis. One major reason is organizations like BlackRock and other financial institutions are buying up properties, which is squeezing the housing supply, and also raising rents for people. So if you are an investor, choose to not invest in things like this, and maybe they won't be as profitable. So something like that.
I love that. Invest wisely. We're actually going to have a podcast on that soon too. So that's a good plug for that.
Two other sources I just want to plug really quickly. This book called Evicted taught me a lot about affordable housing by Matthew Desmond. Really interesting read. And there was an article a couple weeks ago on New York Times Magazine about Vienna and how they've done affordable housing quite well.
Oh,
So 2 other plugs.
thank you. Great resource for us too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Dan, this was such a treat. Thank you so much for joining us.
Very
And
nice to see you again.
we look forward to, what you create and what you do at your new role and position at Battery Park City 2. And we look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks very much. Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.